Welcome to Exploring the Bible, Religious Studies 100. As you know, I am your professor, Dr. Pam Fox, and we are honored to have Dr. Zev Bar-Lev here with us today, a professor of linguistics and a practicing and observant Jew. And he is no longer the adamant atheistic Marxist he was when he was your age. He is very familiar to these halls. He has taught at San Diego State and is now emeritus, 30 years in the linguistics department. So he can teach any of you how to speak any language in just a day using his key words, key letter systems. He doesn't believe in immersion, he believes in using this sheltered initiation. So he has this very innovative method, a brilliant linguist. And when he is not teaching Hebrew or Arabic or Chinese, he is reading in his synagogue. He's reading in Hebrew, or he's teaching Hebrew, or he's lecturing in the community, or he's writing. He writes prolifically memoirs, revising his language books. This is a brilliant, fascinating man and friend and debater, and very much looking forward to hearing what he has to say about his most recent publication, which is this 6-page handout. That was your reading for this weekend. So here is Dr. Zev Bar-Lev, next 50 minutes.
Thank you, Pam, for this. This is my favorite gig, which you invite me to, hopefully often twice a year. It's wonderful. I enjoy this more than any other guest lecture I give. And it helps me focus in on this topic that's so important to me. I'm starting the first topic that I'm working with is the question of the reality of God. Is God real? Or is it one of those ideas like Santa Claus? I hope I'm not revealing anything about Santa Claus. Just a fairy tale or a myth. And I speak from experience on this topic because when I was in college, I was in fact a militant atheist. Very convinced of the great truths that secular civilization in the West had developed over 2,000 years. I was a big fan. Does anyone know the name Bertrand Russell? He was a logical positivist. The West, America, intellectuals are filled with his ideas even if they don't know his name. The idea, for example, of moral truths being not great truths, but rather individual disguised ways of talking about personal preferences. So the positivists propose that to say murder is wrong is simply a disguised way of saying that you don't like murder. So they were looking at this as from an ultra-scientific, or as we might say, an uber-scientific point of view, which has dominated the West and still does in many ways. My own change of mind came when I spent a year as a student of Slavic linguistics in Moscow as an exchange student. After all, the Soviet Union was officially an atheocracy. I have invented that term, but I think it's a good one. What I mean is it's not a theocracy, but one where atheism was the official religion or non-religion. So it should have been an ideal society for me as an idealist atheist. I should have seen the wonderful fruition of all the ideas that I had believed in. And I was depressed very much by what I actually saw there, a society that just didn't work. They found out that it didn't work a few years later. I was there for the 50th anniversary of the Great October Revolution, as they called it, the Great Communist Revolution of 1917. I was there for its 50th anniversary, and then everything looked great, and they were going to overtake the West economically, but they were going to prove the wisdom of atheism. But the Soviet society, as we saw it, was not very impressive. It was, in fact, a very depressing year. Not because they treated us badly. They treated us very well. It's how they treated themselves, how they treated each other that was depressing. Atheism was the rule in that society, and there it was. A society that ultimately didn't work in any way. What does Western society offer in the way of thoughts on God? Well, God doesn't exist. Isn't that obvious? There's no proof that he exists, and since there's no proof, he must not exist. We have the great advance of science from Galileo up through Darwin and up through the modern age, proposing that the Bible is an old book. Why should we follow an old book? Shouldn't we follow the more enlightened insights of our own hearts? Wouldn't it be silly to be one of those old-fashioned religious thinkers who latches on to one verse of the Bible or two verses of the Bible and lives his life according to that? Wouldn't that be crazy? Well, I'm going to mention a surprise in a few minutes, who it was who actually latched onto one biblical verse for his whole life. My story, though, is that I came back from the Soviet Union and was fortunate enough, by a set of lucky coincidences and the wisdom of my wife, began to get into a study of Hebrew and the Bible. In the beginning, it had nothing to do with religion. I was reading Bertrand Russell on the side. In fact, I'll give away that little thing I promised. I read in a biography of Bertrand Russell that his life was, in fact, determined by a favorite verse in the Bible of his spinster aunt's fundamentalist Protestant Bible. And the verse was, "Don't follow a multitude to do evil." And he was so fascinated by the truth contained in it that he made himself the world's biggest nonconformist, denying the Bible, among other things, the very Bible that he'd gotten that verse from, denying that because his famous manifesto is "Why I Am Not a Christian," which was a manifesto of mine at the time. I had it in the anthology that I was reading that told me that he was so influenced by that biblical verse. As I began finding on my own, there were a lot of other good verses in the Bible. Other verses that he missed because he didn't study them all. He just studied one. How silly. The round one, as I call it on the handout, has secular science defeating old-time religion. The problem is that it defeated old-time religion. It didn't pay attention to developments in religion. While Russell and scientists were accusing the religious people of being out of date and ignorant of modern science, they were in fact out of date with developments in religion. So they were attacking the science of hundreds of years earlier and ignoring what was going on in modern religious theory. You know some of these cliches from the old days. The Bible is a book of outdated morals, evil ideas, right? Genocide and slavery and all sorts of other things. Let me jump ahead a little bit, give you something. I'm not following the handout in order, although I'm going to be referring to the 3 rounds, as I call them. Slavery in the Bible. The 5 books of Moses, which are the most important part of the Bible to Jews. They are called the Torah. Torah is often mistranslated as law. The actual meaning of Torah is teaching. If you know the Hebrew word moreh, it's the same root. Torah and moreh, teaching, teacher and teaching. It's not law, it's teaching. and it's a teaching of a way of life. That's what Judaism is, a way of life. The Chinese word for that, you should know, is Tao, properly pronounced Tao. Tao is the way to a Taoist, but Torah is the way to a Jew. Well, what about the legalism that you get in the Bible? Especially Orthodox Jews, right? Not exactly. Fundamentalism is alien to Judaism. The most Orthodox Jews you ever meet do not follow the Bible literally, and they don't pretend to. They follow it through the eyes of a big interpretation called the Talmud. No one follows the Bible literally. Certainly no one religious. And the Orthodox Jews differ from the non-Orthodox Jews in which versions of interpretations they prefer. For example, more modern Jews, such as me, tend to look more at the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and to be a little more skeptical about the Talmud. Yeah, it's got some good ideas, but we'll take them as they come. We'll evaluate each one separately. Not that anyone is a literalist, as I said, but the 5 books of Moses do present the original of what Judaism started out as and what's its base, its trunk, to which the branches, from which the branches come out. What are some of the essential ideas of Judaism? Torah as a way of life. God is concerned with human behavior, not what humans believe. Yes, there are beliefs that are important, but they are far less important. God is quoted as saying, if only they abandoned me but followed my commandments. Torah is a way of life. It consists of commandments, and not only 10. 10 commandments are very important. They're read in synagogues very often, weekly in some services, daily in some others, but they're not the only commandments. Now, Paul in the New Testament considers commandments a curse that God puts on the Jews in order to convince them of the need for salvation with the Messiah. But that's Paul's interpretation. It is very alien to Judaism. In Judaism, in the same Talmud, we thank God for giving us the commandments because commandments are the way of life. These are my commandments, it says, that you shall live by them. Live by them, not die by them. That particular reasoning was used for why saving a life on the Sabbath is not only allowed but required in Judaism. Torah consists of principles for good living. That's what it's all about. So, for example, what's the first commandment? This is a good trick question that you can fool rabbis with, or anyone else who thinks he knows a lot about religion. Most people, when they say, when asked what's the first commandment, will say, oh, they'll go to the first commandment of the 10 commandments. No, I said the first commandment. The first commandment is, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. One of my favorites, by the way. Judaism is not anti-sex, it is pro-sex. But of course, only kosher sex. That means in marriage. Judaism, Torah makes divisions. Every Saturday night we thank God for dividing things up in the world. First, he divides light and darkness. Without dividing them, you have chaos. He divides kosher from non-kosher. Now, of course, there are various degrees of strictness in eating kosher. The principles behind it are principles that are symbolically important even for those who don't observe it. But of course, there are many Jews who don't observe that any more than, many of the other commandments. So it's a sliding scale, if you want. And officially, The word for commandment is mitzvah, and the traditional teaching is that every mitzvah, every commandment counts. Whatever you do is good. Every single commandment counts. We traditionally number the commandments as 613. There are many books, the 613 commandments. They all differ in which the 613 are. There are 4 or 5 that are handled differently. The general idea is that these are so many commandments because they allow us to live our lives more fully. Distinguishing between holy and non-holy, distinguishing between meat and milk, which is part of kashrut. Meat symbolizes death, milk symbolizes life, so we like to distinguish between life and death and observe faithfully the idea of distinctions, because without distinctions, there's chaos in the world. You can't live without making distinctions. Distinctions are a good thing. Male and female are distinct from each other. I'm not going to try to go into all the details because different varieties of Judaism differ extremely. As I say on the handout, I'm not going to go into issues that are partisan political or anything like that, because there are religious and non-religious people on both sides of the political divide. Any issue you can take. Well, there's an old proverb about Jews. Jews tell it too because it's true. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. A Jew is discovered on a desert island, and he's living alone, but he has 2 synagogues. What's the second one for? That's the one I don't go to. Jews love to disagree with each other, which is where democracy comes from, by the way. We are supposed to disagree with each other in a democracy. So Judaism has holiness as the ideal. What does holiness mean? Imitation of God. What's imitation of God mean if you can't see God? Well, we have texts that help us exemplify it and specific commandments to spell it out. Thou shalt not kill, you think, right? No, that's not the commandment at all. It's thou shalt not murder. It's important to make a distinction between murder and killing. Anyone who doesn't make that distinction, well, he's going to be an extreme pacifist. He will have no way of eating animals, for example. Well, and some people go that way, of course, right? As if killing animals is the same as killing human beings. There's a movement afoot to turn the killing of whales and dolphins into a crime. Well, animal rights you can think about as you wish. There are all sorts of varieties of opinion. But the one thing that would be in defiance of traditional Judaism, of Torah, is the idea that humans and animals are the same, or that men and women are the same and interchangeable, or the idea that, that adults and children are just the same. There's an interesting thing I mentioned on the handout. The value of freedom in American values is right along with Torah. Let me pick up something I said a few minutes ago. The Bible is accused of being a pro-slavery book. Ridiculous. The 5 books of Moses are about the freeing of the Jews from Egypt, from slavery. The whole 5 books of Moses has as its starting theme freedom from slavery. It's an anti-slavery book. Yes, slavery existed then and later, but the Bible was criticizing it. I would say the same about the Constitution. Yes, the Constitution, the American law allowed slavery, but it was disallowed by the Constitution. All men are created equal. And by the way, men in 18th century English meant human beings. We have a copy of a dictionary from that time. Look it up. Man, first definition, human being. Second definition, male. All men are created equal, applied to black people, applied to women. It just wasn't able to put it into effect till much, much later. But the ideals were there. All honor to Abraham Lincoln for bringing out the ideal, but it was an ideal in the Constitution. In the same way, in Torah, the ideal is freedom. Freedom of all peoples. Yes, the Torah says that the land of Israel belongs to the people of Israel. That certainly is an idea there. It also says, the very same Torah, do not oppress the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Israel. So what's going on in Israel? Now I'm going to get a little political, breaking my rule, because I do want to make the point, it's on the handout too, that there is nothing inconsistent. One question I got was, why aren't Jews willing to share the land with Palestinians? It's exactly the opposite. Sharing the land with Palestinians, that is a two-state solution, is official Israeli government policy. Who doesn't want to share land? Who believes in a one-state solution? The Palestinians. The Palestinians reject the idea of a state of Israel, a Jewish state living in their midst. They are the ones rejecting. And I believe, and Alan Dershowitz, the great progressive, made the point, if Israelis dropped their weapons all of a sudden, there would be a genocide. If Palestinians dropped their weapons, what would happen? Peace would break out in 2 weeks. Because the only reason for the occupation is Palestinian non-acceptance of the state of Israel. Read and study. As I say towards the end of the handout, read and study. That's the great commandment. It's up to you all as citizens to study the issues of the day. Democracy and Torah both believe in the ability of human beings to study on their own. And we have now the internet, an amazing resource. You can find multiple opinions on anything. People believe that Elvis still lives. Huge numbers of internet sites. You owe it to yourselves to explore positions that maybe some people condemn too easily or mock or tease. You're all citizens. Enjoy the argument. In Jewish culture going way back, it has been wonderful. There's a wonderful custom of disagreeing. It's an essential custom for the functioning of a democracy. Don't take opinions that you hear on face value. So I've talked about Torah. I've given you an idea of what Judaism is like. Let me go to the big idea that I've been driving towards. Have you heard of the TOE, the T-O-E? If you watch Big Bang Theory, you'll see it referenced. Einstein believed in, he just envisaged a theory of everything. A theory of the whole physical universe. Now, he himself was not actually able to go very far with it because he rejected quantum mechanics as it was developing. Did you know about this? He was wrong about that. Quantum mechanics is now a very widely accepted field of physics. But I'm looking for something bigger than the TOE anyway. I call it the TOOT. It's an easy pronunciation for a complicated abbreviation. Theory of the universe and other things. What do I mean? Science cannot cover everything that needs to be covered. Not all truth is scientific truth. Not all reality is physical reality. Houston Smith, great religious scholar of religion, makes this point. He calls it scientism when scientists just take their field as able to cover everything in the whole everything in the universe and beyond, according to how I'm saying it. It's hard to say without tripping over your tongue, but do you get the idea? Theory of the universe and other things. Well, what is there beyond the universe? As Houston Smith talks about, there's all of that stuff that religions talk about. Values, ethics, morality, all of those things that science cannot talk about. And I'll go back now to Bertrand Russell again. He is the one, and his colleagues, who said that ethics must be supernatural. Why? Because it's not in nature. What is cannot give you what should be. So all this talk about humans should be more natural, wait a minute. The whole goal of human life is to be non-natural, to be non-animal. It doesn't mean that you should reject your animal nature either, but surely there are parts of your personality. We don't want to act like animals, do we? Want to eat without utensils? I know certain things elements of it. If I say walking around without clothing, college students will generally think, wow, 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 that's really ideal. Probably for about 2 minutes. We are not animals. Holiness is exactly means not acting like animals. The way Judaism puts it is that we are endowed with a double nature. We are animals on one hand and angels on the other. A combination of both kinds of personality. It's for us to be as angelic, if you want, as we can, to rise above our animal natures, not to give complete freedom to every animal impulse we may have. That is not a way either to societal happiness or to personal happiness. You're not going to be happy if you act like an animal. Animals are happy in their own way, I suppose. Give Fido a bone and he's really happy. Boy. Let me go back to something in the nature of Judaism, a general point, which is a pretty specific idea that I want to bring out. The notion of Messiah in Judaism. It's a sort of, well, it's well known that Judaism has the Messiah in the distant future. I really want to suggest, and Jews won't be terribly surprised if I suggest it in synagogue as I have, that in Judaism it's really essential for the Messiah not to come till the end of the world. In fact, there's a little joke in Jewish-Christian dialogue. If Jesus comes back, and announces himself as the Messiah, Jews will say, "Have you been here before?" But that's not the important question. And I really want to suggest that the notion of Messiah as a world figure, a utopian, is really alien to Torah. Someone who has solutions to all the world's problems. I suggest that this is where the false god of communism came from. And I talk about the progression that I believe is a necessity if you take a secular position. I call it the secular progression. I'll shorten it and say, if you start with Darwin, you will end up with Hitler and Mao. Now, I don't mean that Darwin is wrong or that we should have anti-Darwin parades. Most modern Jews, like most modern scientists, including Christians, accept Darwinian evolution as a generally correct theory of how creatures evolved. There is no issue in Judaism about that. I know some Orthodox people who like to argue with it in certain ways. The important thing about evolution from a religious perspective is that it is God-driven. Evolution is tending towards the end of creatures like us wonderful human beings who have the ability to rise above animal nature. There's a little thing in science called the Anthropic Principle, which is actually, within physics, the best argument for God, because it turns out scientifically that the constants of the universe have to be within a very narrow range called the Goldilocks range. If gravity were a little stronger, the universe would be a ball of matter in the middle. If it were a little weaker, it would be just cosmic dust. The universe seems to be so constructed that it was destined from the beginning with the constants that are defined by it. By who? With the physical constants like gravity, to give rise to creatures who would be able to study it. Scientists don't like coincidences, they like to explain it. You know how scientists react to this one. You can see it on not only Big Bang references to it, but on Fringe, if that program still exists. Multiverse. There can't be a principle where someone decides to make the constants of a particular Goldilocks range that will allow them to be human beings to arise, to study the universe. That's too theological. So there must be infinite number of different universes. This gives rise to multiverse theory. Well, where has empirical science come if we're now talking about multiverses because we couldn't imagine the existence of a God? On that same topic, it's interesting, it was pointed out by a guy by the name of Jastrow, he has a book on it, God, Genesis, and the Big Bang, I think it's called, maybe Genesis and the Big Bang, points out that physicists for over a decade or two rejected Big Bang theory. Why? Because it looked too much like Genesis to them. The opposition between religion and science is a false one. If you try to eliminate God, you will end up having to eliminate everything. Ethics, of course, goes out the window, but if you want to ask if God exists, why not ask if electrons exist, if the atom exists? And I got to tell you, if you ask physicists, they cannot come up with a positive answer to yes, atoms exist, and certainly not an answer that will satisfy anyone of a traditional philosophical perspective. The existence of God, God doesn't exist, I can't kick him, can I? Well, you can't kick electrons either. You can't kick atomic particles. So if God doesn't exist, well, what does exist? The problem with proving the existence of God, it's an incoherent kind of idea. You can't prove God's existence, but there are three elements there: proving, God, and existence. Of these three, God is actually the least problematic. Proving and existence are the two problem notions here. And if you don't think so, try to define either one. Because if you define existence as meaning something that you can kick or hit, that idea hasn't been a belief of traditional religious people for thousands of years, talking about being out of date. So here we go. I'm suggesting that the tout, as I pronounce it, the theory of the universe and other things, must contain a scientific component, but it also must contain a religious component. You want true science on one hand? Sure, but you ought to have true religion on the other hand. What do we mean by that? Well, that's going to take study, of course. No reason you should think that you should get that automatically any more than you would in physics. So there's the general point. Judaism versus Christianity. Why don't I just finish up with a brief comparison? Christianity is a very nice religion, as I like to say. I'm a great fan of Christianity, as I like to say, with just a tint of irony. It's the second best religion in the whole world. I do like Judaism better. I do think it is a little bit closer to the mark on a number of different issues. One of them is, I think, the asceticism, anti-sex view of Christianity. I mentioned that be fruitful and multiply is the first commandment in Judaism. Life is the first commandment. Pacifism also comes from the extremism that I believe can be found in the New Testament. So I think Jesus, he was a Pharisee, by the way. That's why the New Testament calls him rabbi all the time. Rabbis are the beginners of modern Judaism. Pharisaic Judaism or rabbinic Judaism. Jesus was a Pharisee, but he took some extreme positions. For example, the position that divorce is not allowed. If that was Jesus' position, maybe there can be argument about that too, but it is not the position in Judaism. In Jewish marriages, we don't say till death do us part, although it's certainly an ideal. There is a line in the Talmud that God weeps when a first marriage dissolves, ends in divorce. So basically, other contrasts with Christianity I have on the handout. So I wouldn't want to read them if I could. Is this a good place to stop for questions? Yes? Your lollipop?
You can. Your laptop?
Oh, laptop. I heard lollipop, and that sounded like a good idea, too. But you'll have to come up to the microphone. And I have to... Am I in the right place?
You're right.
Well, my question is, how does science not correlate with God? Because you're trying to say that it doesn't exist. But the science method starts from observations, and it proceeds to laws, and from the theories, they're hypothesized to be true or not. So I was thinking that the Bible is, in a way, a tool, because in the Bible, the laws are written, and as time goes on, we can observe that what is written in the Bible has come true. And I have an example. So in Revelations, chapter 8, verse 1, in the New International Version, it says that we have opened the seventh seal, and there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. So
Let me jump in already, because the question is already very complicated, and I'll forget it.
Sorry.
Number one, Judaism does not, of course, accept the New Testament as divinely inspired in the same way, let's say. Not going to deny that there are good ideas in the New Testament, but it's simply not a part of Judaism. If you ask me, what do you think of Jesus? I'll ask you, what do you think of the Book of Mormon as a Christian, or Buddha, for that matter? They're just not a part of our tradition.
Okay.
The Talmud does not mention Jesus. One way I like to put it is that Jesus could have actually been a rabbi in the Talmud, but Paul decided to bring him out in a separate paperback edition, a smaller book, separate. That was Paul's decision. I don't know how Jesus felt about it, but he's classified as a rabbi, which means he was a Pharisee. He participated in the same kinds of arguments, although he does take an extreme position. As far as prediction, let me say, in Judaism, it is very much discouraged to predict the end of the world by dating. It's just simply discouraged because it can't be done accurately.
I have an example here. Not when the end of the world is, but I have an example that has to do with the wars. Like
Well,
the First
let me
World
give you
War.
a good example. I believe that the Hebrew Bible, the story of Joseph, predicts the fate of the Jews in the Soviet Union. Joseph was, I'm going to be a little radical here, even for the synagogue, Joseph, I believe, was the first Messiah. He has this world plan to fix the whole world, and he does. He fixed the whole economy of Egypt. And what happens? The Egyptian people are brought into slavery. You can read that in the Bible if you read it closely. They hand over all their profit to Pharaoh. They establish state socialism. And what happens to the Jews? They end up being slaves of slaves. So basically, as I said before, Judaism is suspicious of messiahs, We put it off till the very end, after I leave.
I guess I'm coming from a Christian perspective. That's why I'm using like verses from the Bible.
Yeah, I use verses from the Bible all the time.
But you're like
My
so
Bible.
for Judaism, so
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to ask my question, I guess.
Well, I'm here to talk about Judaism, and I've said that Judaism and Christianity coincide in large measure in terms of values. That's the important thing. God and I both don't care what you believe. Christians are not going to Jewish hell because they don't believe in Judaism, although, by the way, Christians believe in everything in Judaism anyway. A Christian will see nothing in Judaism, in a synagogue or anywhere else, that is in any way offensive to Christianity. We just differ on whether the New Testament. We agree on the Bible. We just disagree on the New Testament, which is, by the way, not such a terrible thing. Friends can disagree about some things. So we don't think you're going there. There is not a Jewish hell, but a Jewish purgatory for the very traditional. But we're very much discouraged from getting too specific about it. Judaism is oriented towards this world, even in the beginning, and even among the very Orthodox. It's oriented towards this world and what you should do here and now, how you should live your life, not to make plans and pack your baggage for going somewhere else. So, indirect answer, I'm sure it's not satisfactory. And another question, though. On to someone else.
Thank you. We have time for one last question.
I don't know. It was not. It was just on one of the handouts. You said science is a way to understand God.
Right.
So I was just wondering, like, how can you understand God through science if science proves that God doesn't exist?
Well, science doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. All of those things on the handout, God doesn't exist, science says so, were the bad old guys that I disproved. That was round one.
Okay.
I'm sorry if I didn't make that clear.
Okay.
Got to follow who the battling parties are. Science does not. All of those ideas in the box, in the funny-looking box, are ideas of old secular science supposedly defeating old religion. But again, it's defeating only old religion, and it doesn't work. Let me mention on science, because I had wanted to say a little bit more. Science does not work by making meticulous observations for 1,000 years and making laws and then going for... No, it doesn't work that way. Read Karl Popper, P-O-P-P-E-R. I used to teach him as part of mathematical linguistics. Karl Popper, The Hypothetico-Deductive Method of Science. How do you make a scientific theory? You just think it up, and then you test it. We don't do meticulous observation until after we have the theory to test. We test theories, we don't make them up. And laws and observations are really very passé in practicing science today. Good question, though.
You spoke of earlier saying that Jesus was a Pharisee.
Yes.
Go more in depth in how you explain that he is a Pharisee when he completely says that the Pharisees are wrong in the way that they are talking, in the way that they talk down about people, in the way they put themselves above the rest of the Jews in that time period. Explain how he, in your mind, is a Pharisee.
Great. This is not based on Jewish analysis particularly. This is modern scholarship. He criticizes the Pharisees. Guess who else, as being formalistic and legalistic, right? Guess who else criticized the Pharisees for being that way?
Themselves?
Themselves. The Pharisees were the biggest critics of the Pharisees. They criticized each other for being legalistic. The Pharisees allowed divorce on grounds of incompatibility. Jesus didn't. Who is stricter? Who is more formalistic? I think these are complicated issues. Don't misunderstand that I'm making a simple comparison. But rabbi is the word for Pharisee. Modern Judaism, all Judaism in the modern world, is the product of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the rabbis. We call it rabbinic Judaism. And they called each other rabbi, which means my teacher. It's just a word for teacher. So he was criticizing the other Pharisees, but so did they. Hillel was the greatest Pharisaic teacher. Hillel the Elder. There are books on him. You can Google him. He's the guy who is contrasted with another teacher. I won't even mention the other guy's name. The other guy has a student come to him, a skeptic. By the way, when Christians like to convert people, they got it from Judaism. Hillel was a great converter of people. So when a skeptic came to the other rabbi and said, "Rabbi, tell me the whole Torah," while standing on one foot, what did the other guy do? He chased him away with a stick. What did Hillel do? He said, "Love your neighbor as yourself. This is the whole of the Torah. The rest is commentary." Don't forget the last words he said. They're on the handout. "Now go study the commentary." It's your duty as a human being to study the commentary. The Talmud is the product of the Pharisaic rabbis, 15,000 pages long, and that's in Hebrew. It's twice as long in English. And that is their commentary. And an Orthodox person is someone who follows the Talmud. When an Orthodox person says a Torah Jew, he means someone who follows the Talmud. So there we go. Have I answered the question?
Yeah, that makes sense. I've heard multiple stories of how people refer to Jesus as the rabbi, as the great teacher. So I was making that connection that you're making in that is just keep referring, I am a devout Christian. My dad is a chaplain in the military as a Baptist background. So he's done his studying as well, and I've learned it from him.
Great.
And so just hearing those same stories, when I read that one line and I saw those comparisons you're making between Christianity and Judaism in your paper as a Christian, I was feeling like you're speaking to us as a soft matter, that we don't take the Old Testament, as we refer to it, as serious. You think that we take the New Testament more serious? Well, we take both, and we believe both a lot. You know.
That's fine. And if I say, as I do, that the New Testament is not for us divine scripture, let me make a comparison. When a Christian asks, "What do you think of Jesus?" that's sort of like asking a Christian, "What does he think of Buddha?" or "What does he think of the Book of Mormon?" You can have various opinions, but it's simply outside of the tradition. A Christian doesn't think anything about Buddha. It's not in his tradition. Jesus is someone who, and let me go back to this other point, Messiah versus Redeemer. Messiahs in Judaism have caused us no end of trouble. They are utopian figures who usually cause more trouble than they're worth. I would suggest there was a false Messiah in the Middle Ages that's very famous. Communism was a false god, a false Messiah in that sense. But I'm saying it's not so much a question of whether true or false. Messiahs cause Jews more trouble than they're worth. They do not usually accomplish their utopian plans. Jesus did not, after all, achieve world peace. Right. So not a question of whether he's a true Messiah or a false Messiah. There's a little Jewish joke if Jesus in the second coming comes back to earth and announces himself as the Messiah, Jews will ask him, "But tell me, have you been here before?" While I'm telling jokes, I should mention Fiddler on the Roof I just happened to see by accident. Wonderful movie. If you want to find out about Judaism, its traditional context, it is a wonderful source. Good music, too.
We have time for another question.
Good.
Okay, so in your comparison between Judaism and Christianity, you said that Judaism, you believe that actions can be wrong, but not thoughts, and I can't really grasp that. I don't really understand.
Yeah. Oh, good. Jesus said, for example, if you lust after a woman in your heart, then you have committed adultery.
Right.
In Judaism, absolutely not. Now, the New Testament is subject to interpretation too. He's saying you're committing adultery in your heart. Who cares if you commit it in your heart? The point is whether you commit it in reality, because it's in reality that it busts up families. We all have lots of thoughts that some of them are not so nice. Did you know that? Thoughts in Judaism are just not condemned. Of course, if you go into them, if you don't, it's how you handle them. It's sort of like when someone says something to you, it's not what he says or how you feel, it's how you respond. In Judaism, thoughts are simply not condemned as such, unless you follow up on a bad thought. So that's a very stark difference, I would say, between Judaism and Christianity.
Okay, so even if I commit a good deed for someone, but in my heart or in my mind, I'm hating that person, that's still a good deed?
Yeah, some people say Christians believe we're going to hell. Isn't that awful? But they don't treat us as if we're going to hell. They don't treat us like hell. Christians in America particularly treat us very nicely. If you want to be an anti-Semite in your heart, but you treat us this well, that's fine with me.
Okay, but
perfectly happy with that.
I wouldn't say that thinking someone is going to hell is necessarily something that's wrong. I mean, okay, it's kind of like, okay, that's a fact. To a Christian, that's a fact. It's not a bad thought. So that's how I would combat that.
Well, I'm saying the same thing. I don't want to criticize people for their beliefs, period. I don't care about someone's theology. I care about how he behaves.
Okay.
You know, yes, Judaism is very strict about idolatry in the beginning, but as it evolved, it realized, no, the idolatry is not the problem. And over the last 1,000 years, even idol worshippers, if they behave well, are we say they're worshiping God through the idol.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. With a question.
Hi, you mentioned that atheocracy was kind of your revelation, or your journey in the Soviet Union was kind of your revelation because they had atheocracy. Was it the act of, or was the individual, was the morality of the individual or the morality of the community that you saw as really the true problem with atheocracy?
Both. Communism was founded as a way of solving all human problems. We're not going to have any envy because everybody's going to have whatever he needs. The problem is, again, it's materialism that told them that if everybody has, it's commonly believed that poverty is the cause of crime. Well, there are white-collar criminals who are poor, and there are poor people who don't commit crimes. It's values. It's not whether you're poor or not. Having tried both, I can say, as the Jewish proverb says, poverty is not the better of them. Rather be rich than poor anytime. But that values is what causes crime. Bad values cause crime. So let me talk about my concept of the tut, which is an original phrase and concept of mine, but I am working on it. The theory of the universe and other things. Einstein thought about the theory of everything. He envisaged it. He actually he rejected quantum mechanics and therefore screwed up and didn't even achieve as full a TOE as he could have. Theory of everything. But I'm making the point that the theory of everything is not enough. And the tut is the theory of the universe and other things. What else is there besides the physical universe? Well, there's all of the rest of reality. Spiritual reality, ethical reality, moral reality, values reality. We don't need only good science, we need good religion too. How do I know what good religion is? The same way I know what good science is. You investigate, you see how they work, you study them, you study what their theory is, you study their implications. If you see a religion that's out there murdering people because they don't believe in the religion, that's a bad religion. Don't ask me to prove it any more than I can prove what makes a good theory in science. As I mentioned on the handout, my background is in cognitive science. I taught methods of science as part of mathematical linguistics. I know it well. There's a myth around that science is, you do science by little observations, and then you, hundreds of years later, you come up with little laws. And then you try to formulate your laws. Science doesn't work that way. If any of you want more reading on that, I would recommend Karl Popper, Popper, on the nature of science explanation. You will understand it better if you're not addicted to the junior high view of science where you make little experiments. Science doesn't work that way. So what I'm looking for in this concept of tout is a theory of the universe and other things. It contains in particular not only the 4 dimensions of physical reality, but a 5th dimension. That 5th dimension includes ethics, morality. That's what religion has been specializing in. Do they read Houston Smith here? No, not in this class. Okay. He's a good guy to read. Houston Smith on scientism. When science studies some little thing and then pretends it can talk about everything else in the world. You know, just because you study even linguistics, which is a wonderfully varied field, doesn't mean you can talk about nuclear science. Once you've defined the field as containing only physical reality as its domain, you can't then go say, okay, now I've solved that problem, I can go tell you about everything else. It's ridiculous. It's stupid. As I put it on the handout, old science, new secularism of 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago defeated old religion. But it was using an outdated model of religion even then. Most modern people, although I think most people are atheists in practice, if not in belief, they are attacking a version of religion that, oh, for sure it still exists some places, but a kind of rigidity that is just not there if you look at real religious communities. Okay?
Good. Another question?
You mentioned how you're an atheist once, and I'm just wondering, like out of curiosity, who would you like mourn to, or just when you're just
Who was I?
Who would you mourn to during struggles in your life or having hardships as an atheist?
Who would I
mourn to, or like
Oh.
pray to, or
Well, I think atheists lack a feeling. Well, an atheist friend that I've debated with over many decades, I mentioned the moral benefits of gratitude. And he said, well, gratitude has moral benefits, but who should you be grateful to? There's no God, so who can you be grateful to? The atheist has a real problem, and it's not only when you're miserable. I never faced anything unfortunate enough, miserable enough in terms of personal circumstance. In Russia, I lived very well on the scholarship that I had. So, as I said, the Russians didn't treat me badly. They treated each other and themselves badly. So I just don't think you can respect yourself unless you have some sort of higher concept. Ethics, as everyone agrees who's studied it, ethics depends on some external reference. Morality depends on an external reference. If you have no external reference, anything goes. You have no one to thank. You have no one to complain to. Okay?
I think we have time for one more question.
One more. Last one.
For extra credit. Someone get up there. It's a race to the mic.
Race to the mic.
Okay, so you talked about moral behavior as important.
Yeah.
And so what if you don't believe in God, but you believe in moral behavior? What's your view on that?
Well, that's fine. I'd rather you started believing in God, but I'm not going to say...
Well, it's not necessarily pertaining to me, but what would God think of somebody that lives like a moral life but doesn't do anything bad? You know, what does God do about that?
As I said, I think God's main criterion is behavior. Judaism teaches that. A good person is worth a lot more than all the preachers in the world. Moral behavior is the thing.
Independent of God belief or...
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
My argument with atheism is that once you start asking, why is this more moral than that, you have no way to answer it. Once you ask yourself, well, what would be so bad if I really murdered someone, which actually is what Woody Allen's film Crimes and Misdemeanors is about. What's going to stop me? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing to stop you in your mind or anywhere else. The police force, well, they're there to catch you when you do a crime, not to prevent you from doing it.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you.
Good question.
All right, it's time to say thank you to Dr. Zev Bar-Lev.